Hello everyone, this is Pastor Blake, and we're continuing our study in the book of Daniel in chapter 11, verses 20 through 45. Last week we talked about verses 1 through 19, and it was just so much information. I wanted to break it down in kind of two sections. And so as we look into verse 20, we know that through history we can understand a lot of what these words meant, a lot of even very specific phrases within these scriptures. And these verses actually are fulfilled by certain things these kingdoms did, these kings did. And remember how in chapter 11, we're really talking about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, okay? Anytime we are talking about Seleucus or Antiochus or those names, Demetrius even, those are the northern kingdoms, okay? And then when we're talking about Ptolemy, okay, all of the Ptolemies and their children, we're talking about the southern kingdom, okay? So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are really the only two that are being talked about mostly in chapter 11. And then we see that Rome is going to come into it. So Rome is obviously more of the Western kingdom coming in to take over all of it, okay? So just like in the first dream, the Babylonian Empire was going to be taken over by the Medo-Persian, and the Grecian Empire was going to take over that. We're at the kind of the end almost of the Grecian Empire going into the Roman Empire, okay? So that's where we're at. And so in verse 20, we see that Antiochus is the third son, Seleucus the fourth, took over after him and sent a tax collector to collect money to pay Rome. Now remember in verses 17, 18, 19, it talks about how Rome basically told them to stop this. He made him, he was having to pay a very big treaty, and that Antiochus is the third, he actually was plundering temples trying to get back this tribute that he had to pay to Rome. And so now it basically fell on the next leader, which is his son, Seleucus the fourth. So after he took over, he sent tax collector to go and get tribute to pay Rome and to tax his own people. In the tribute to Rome, we know was 1,000 talents, and he tried to plunder the temple even in Jerusalem, and he was poisoned by his own tax collector. We know that tax collector was Heliodorus, and so Heliodorus was the tax collector. He basically sent him into very dangerous territory because the Jewish people were going to protect their temple, and so he said, you know what, I'm going to poison the king, get out of all of this. And so he did, actually. So then his son, Seleucus the fourth, son Demetrius, was actually the rightful heir to the throne. So really, it's just the whole kind of family nobility kind of thing going on. It should have been his son that took over. But remember how in chapter 11, the last few verses, it talks about how Rome actually had a few hostages at the moment. Well, Demetrius, his son, was actually one of those hostages. And so his son actually couldn't take over. And so there's just this another guy that came along, probably from within the family as well, Antiochus the fourth, okay? Now this is also the little horn in chapter 8. If you want to go back and read the little horn, this is who we would have interpreted this to be because of his persecution of the Jewish people. And so Antiochus the fourth, he actually did bribe a lot of people to get himself into power, and it worked. We talked, his name was Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, which is called the manifest one. So he believed himself not only to worship gods, but also be a god on the earth, okay? Others call him Epimanes, which meant madman, because of the way he was a tyrant, he was a ruthless leader. He did things, horrible things, to everyone around him, especially the Jewish people. And so we look at that, and we're going to talk about this guy, Antiochus the fourth, for pretty much the rest of the chapter for the most part. In verses 22 through 23, we see how Egypt, under Ptolemy, the southern kingdom, Egypt, the sixth leadership, attacked Antiochus the fourth. He said, in the power struggle, he's not the real heir. People won't really serve him. Well, they went up and attacked him. The southern kingdom of Egypt, under Ptolemy the sixth leadership, attacked him, but was defeated, and was then held as a hostage, Ptolemy the sixth. And somehow, Ptolemy the sixth, as Antiochus being a horrible leader, they actually convinced him, hey, while I've been in prison, I came and attacked you, I was defeated, you got me. While I was under imprisonment, my brother took over the kingdom. Let me come back. We'll make amends with each other. We'll sign a treaty with whatever. We'll be friends from now on. And let me go back and get my other my kingdom back from my brother. And Antiochus, being someone who wanted power, who wanted rule, someone who was probably thirsty for more control, he maybe even been thirsty for other people to have control as well. Kind of like, oh, well, I mean, I wouldn't want anything to happen like that to my kingdom. I'll let him go back. We'll be friends. Our kingdoms will in in peace and stuff. So he let him go. Antiochus let Ptolemy go. And then when Ptolemy got back there, what do you think he did? Obviously, he teamed up with his brother and went and attacked him again. And so they went and attacked Antiochus again and broke covenant with him. And he actually was able to force Antiochus up out of Egypt. And so even though his brother did take over the kingdom, that was probably a plan all along. But the Ptolemy brothers got together and they kicked him out of Egypt. And so, or at least they were pushing him back as much as they could. And then we do see the next thing we do read about in verse 24. We know that Antiochus actually did go and plunder the richest of Egypt's territories before he was being pushed out completely. Before he got out, he said, "You know what? We're taking something with us when we go." And so we do know that he actually did plunder some of Egypt's richest territories. He even divided it up with his soldiers, which is honestly kind of a rare thing to happen. But he did this. He just wanted to really just show the Ptolemies that, you know what, he was in control. And so verses 25 to 27, there are actually many questions about these passages because many believe this was a reference back to the original attack on Egypt originally. And he tried to make this because the verses make no sense in light of history. In verses 25 through 27, it is a section that just seems to be a little out there. It seems like almost the subject changes up. And so we don't know anything through history that would match these up. So we're considering that it could have been a reference how in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then the next few verses, it kind of gives a more detailed description. That could be some a way it was happening. It could be that, hey, Egypt was attacked, blah, blah, blah. He kept on going. And then he says, oh, yeah, but by the way, the events in 25 through 27 happened as well. So we're not super sure, but they do believe that is a more recapped of the initial details. So we know that Ptolemy VI's uncles encouraged for him to attack Antiochus IV. We know that they were behind it. They kind of just wanted to make sure the northern kingdom was put in its place. Remember, the northern kingdom and southern kingdom were constantly fighting, and just to kind of push back on that idea that they were all in control. So we just kind of have to take that as it is. In verse 28, we see on the way home from plundering Egypt from the richest places, Antiochus IV found an insurrection starting and severely reacted. So as he was being pushed out of Egypt after he did that, he did see a few of the Jewish people going against some of his leadership that was in the area, some of his forces, not paying their tributes as they were supposed to. And so he severely reacted of the rage of his defeat and everything, of his pushback of his kingdom. He was enraged. We know that he even killed over 80,000 Jewish men, women, and children. 80,000 people. Because of this insurrection, and really that right there was it. That's all they could take. The Jews did decide to start a full-on rebellion, and that is known today as the Maccabean Revolt. In 2 Maccabees 5:15 through 21, you can read about that. But it's a very known, well-documented case because of all the 8,000 people that were killed. Jewish people said, you know what, that's it. We are going to completely revolt against him. We're going to go after him as hard as we can. And we see that as kind of unveiling in verse 28. In verse 29 through 30, though, Antiochus IV invaded Egypt again, but was greatly defeated. Now, obviously, the Jewish people were completely in a revolt. The Ptolemies would have been trying to defend their kingdom. So all of Egypt was after Antiochus now. It wasn't that he just come in and plundering. It was everyone was against him. Nobody wanted him in the kingdom anymore. So he was greatly defeated. The Ptolemies even convinced Rome to join in. They said, look, this guy is just, he is not leaving anyone alone in this land. And we do know that his kingdom beforehand had went up in Greece, and Rome kind of stopped him, pushed him back. So, Rome could have said, you know what? They even tried to attack us. Let's go ahead and help them. Let's go help that southern kingdom. And so We do know that Rome actually did join forces with them. Antiochus IV was no match for the Roman army and the ships of Kittim. Now, the ships of Kittim are actually understood a place. It was a city in the southern part of Cyprus. Okay, you can look on a map where Cyprus is. We know that it was a city somewhere in the southern end of of Cyprus, and Cyprus is known as being a very well harvesting place for wood. It has lots and lots of trees on it, and so they were able to build these really nice ships for Rome. And also they had lots of copper deposits, were able to smelter copper very well with also a lot of extra wood around. And so we do know the ships of Kittim actually were able to have this protective barrier around the very front of them so that they could ram into other ships, and that protective barrier was made of copper. And so, obviously, not necessarily the strongest material out there, but certainly stronger than wood. And we know that they actually were able to sharpen the edges so that when they pierced ships, it would literally just break through ships. And so the ships of Kittim were a very big, powerful force in the ancient world. This was something not to mess around with. These were powerful ships, and Rome in itself being a powerful empire, they would have used these against Antiochus. So we see this as, they were not prepared for this battle. And so Kittim was that small town. You can look it up. It's got lots of details, actually. You can really learn a lot about them. And but many historians actually did write about this defeat of Antiochus IV because it was such a brutal one, even to the fact that Antiochus decided to leave Egypt. But beforehand, one of the generals of Rome actually went to Antiochus and said, "Look, you can either leave Rome or we will kill you. You will be in an entire battle with the entire empire. That is what you're doing. You're risking an entire all-out war that we will destroy you. Look at our ships, look at our people, look at our trained soldiers. You're not going to win this." And then what he did, the general actually took out a sword and drew a circle around Antiochus IV and said, "Make your decision before you leave the circle." That would have been crazy to see that. I mean, basically, he's saying, you just try us. Just try us, Antiochus. And so, being somewhat of having some discernment, knowing that was not going to work, Antiochus did decide to leave Egypt in 167 BC. He turned his rage against Palestine, unfortunately, though, around the Jewish area, everything around Jerusalem. And so he turned his rage against that. It was kind of his own kingdom, so, Rome necessarily was like, well, we're not going to get involved. But Antiochus, he did that. He sent a tax collector, Apollonius, to Jerusalem to collect the taxes. And it seemed like he actually came in and was a pretty generous tax collector. He wasn't pushy with them. But then all of a sudden, on the Sabbath, all of a sudden he just started killing people. Horrible moments. But he also was then rewarding people for who was supporting Hellenistic policies. And so for the Jews that were going against him, he just was slaughtering people on the Sabbath, one of their most holy days. But then on the people that were living in Hellenistic policies, Jews that were giving into some of the Greek culture, well, they were being rewarded. And so there was just this rift in the Jewish people at this time that would have been horrible to be a part of, and very confusing, and not knowing who was bad or good or whatever. But in verses 31 through 32, it says, about a year later, we know in 167 the Syrian forces came back to stop the Jews from religious practices. Antiochus, basically, he couldn't control anything that he wanted to, so he can control the only thing that he could. And it was the Jewish people that were not ready for battling and all that kind of stuff. So he did come back to stop religious practices. He even entered the temple to stop the burnt offerings, which was a very big offense. This could be also the temple and fortress that it talks about in 31-32. The temple is also known as a fortress, so it could have been two different physical places, but it could have actually been referring to one thing, as the temple and like their fortress of God, we don't fully know, but it could have been two places, could have been one. He did set up an idol to Zeus in the temple, which would have profaned the temple and altogether. We see that the abomination that makes desolate, it offers up, they were offering up sacrifices to Zeus, which we know was usually pig sacrifices. So consider they were taking in the temple of God animals that they were not even supposed to have in there. A Jewish person was never supposed to touch. God said was unclean in that moment. And then taking another god, an idol, putting him in there, sacrificing on the altars of God to this other idol. That would have been just an ultimate just slap in the face to every single Jewish people of the land. And so we do see this happening multiple times. This is kind of when sometimes in prophecy, at one point, God can be using the historical moments to talk about certain instances. And then he starts to talk almost like weave in and out, kind of like both together, what did happen and then also what was happening in the future. And then as we'll see in the rest of this chapter, this is almost where that transition is going into maybe more of just apocalyptic and nothing to do with the history at all. So keep that in mind, because the abomination of desolation will also happen. We hear it talking about in Matthew 24:15 through 21, and then 2 Thessalonians 2:3 through 4. Okay, and so we do see this happening multiple times in the Bible. And then Matthew, it says, just like in Daniel, when you see this happening, so it did happen, we know, but also Jesus is referring, hey, this is going to happen again, so be ready for it. And then 2 Thessalonians tell us what to know what is happening when that happens. Okay, 2 Thessalonians 2, chapter 2, 3 through 4. We know that some of the Jews actually did accept this. They didn't actually revolt against him. They kind of just started following him, and this is kind of part of what that Maccabean revolt came from. Okay. In verses 33 through 35, we see many people were actually involved with the Maccabean revolt, which killed around 10,000 plus people, a horrible instance of just death. And some joined the revolt out of passion and some out of survival. We know that some of the Jewish people were fighting to stop this horrible person's control. Other people were, when they saw an army coming and they knew the Jewish people of this city were fighting against them, well, they're not going to know who was against them or not against them. So some started fighting simply out of pure survival. And so we do know that some were forced to join more or less from just being Jewish, and some of them were joined in trying to stop this tyrant. And so that's some of the things that happened. Some forces from Hasidim joined in later and killed those Jews who were starting to turn from God. So they were like another sect of people in a different area that were actually killing people that were not standing up for their belief system. The wise shall stumble, it says in verses 33 through 35. It probably refers to the true believers who were going to die during that persecution. The people that actually were dying because of this revolt and because of the warring against Antiochus IV. But one thing we can always have to consider is that all the time throughout church history, now this is not a fun thing, but all throughout church history, church is constantly being refined and then strengthened by persecution. Even though people die, the people that are really steadfast in Christ will remain there. And the people who aren't really following Christ, who aren't really following God, they're going to leave. They're not going to die for something they don't really believe in. And so we are strengthened in that our numbers are truly defined, and we're refined. We're getting out the people that don't understand really who God is and not really serving him. And so even though this is a horrible thing to hear about, and we know that, in the verse 35, it says, until the end of time, this will continue. We know that persecution to the church, to the body of Christ, to God's people, will always continue. But the thing is, it does strengthen and refine us. And so we know this will not continue. It won't never stop, but it will continue. But we keep pressing forward. We keep our faith in toward God. We keep leaning on God for guidance and direction in our lives. And so I encourage you with that. Verse 36, this is where really we seem to see that, we were talking about history, and then we started talking about like kind of what was going to happen in the history right then, but then also into the future. Now this 36 is really agreed upon that this is more when kind of nothing of the history of Daniel was happening at this point, and this is where more only apocalyptic things were being talked about at this time. So that transition is sometimes kind of how prophecy works. God can do that. He can talk about history, then talk about two different events with the same meaning, the same focus, and then switch into more of this only, apocalyptic or prophetic kind of in the future, way future event. So this is 36 is kind of when that does happen. This is where many people believe it shifts, and it talks about more of the Antichrist in the 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 through 4, and then again in Revelations 13, 5 through 8. You can read those. Antiochus IV was very powerful, and it talks about how he was powerful. He could do anything he wanted. The thing is, at this point, he couldn't do anything he wanted. Rome was kind of starting to be in control at this moment. That's why we see it kind of not making sense with him. So it could have been a twofold meaning, or it could have been just an apocalyptic meaning. In verses 37 to 39, we see Antiochus would have not abandoned Zeus as God he worshipped. Zeus actually embodied military might, and so he was trying to do that. So it says, he was letting go of all of the gods of his fathers and stuff. That wouldn't have made sense, because Zeus was the person that he would worship to get all of this military might. So it seems like it's more of an Antichrist looking figure as we hear in Revelations. And so the Antichrist will be the strongest ruler ever. We do know that, and Antiochus was just simply not. In verses 40 through 43, we see Antiochus IV never did anything within these verses. This could be some clues of what the Antichrist will be doing, though, in the end time. So we can look toward that. And verses 44 through 45, we know that Antiochus IV died in a campaign in Persia in 164. And the glorious mountain that this is talking about, which would have been in reference to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which could refer to the fall of Antichrist, which is in Revelation 16, 13 through 16, at the Battle of Armageddon. Read that, read Revelation 16, and on into where it really gives more details about how the Battle of Armageddon will go, how Jesus will come down, with flames of fire, and out of his mouth the sword will kill those opposing him. So that's kind of the idea what we're talking about here. But as we go through these, we can only accept what we see. We can only look into it just so much before, sometimes God doesn't tell us everything. God leaves mysteries in our lives, and we just pray that he will unveil those mysteries whenever he sees fit. But we do see this as more of, from a 36 on, as more of an Antichrist looking figure that could be more of that apocalyptic literature that we're looking at. So compare the verses as you go. Think about it. Stop the video, read some, press play, read some more. Do that, and go through this and see what you think. And you can comment and ask me questions if you would like. But next week we will finish up our study, the book of Daniel. Chapter 12. It's exciting. Read it before you watch the video next week, and be encouraged this week. God is still in control. No matter what all this stuff is happening, no matter how bad it could get, no matter what the persecution could be in your life, God is in control. He is not taken off guard. Keep the faith. Thank you.